here. This week, we have an intriguing story by a fascinating writer, Cedric Carey. Tell you what, why don't we just let Cedric introduce himself, huh? By name, I'm called Cedric. By trade, I'm called a vagrant, a vagabond, traveling from city to city in search of distance. Maybe you want to label that as freedom. Some would call me a rogue, a deserter. Some would speak my name in the hushed whispers as if speaking of the dead, of a ghost, a boogeyman. I'm trying to appease those that would shed blood simply because I didn't feel like following their rules. So I pretend to be dead. I've faked my death more times than I can count, eluding the grasp of murderous hands that would clutch me till breath was extinguished, or the will to fight, whichever would occur first. I haunt nothing and no one, and I leave nothing but a cold trail behind me. Maybe, one day, they'll let me go. Let me breathe without the ice fingers gripping my lungs, the knowing that they're so close on my trail. Now, an account of Cedric getting a taste of the Big Apple. Fingers, long and scarred, tunneled back through dirty blonde hair. It had gotten long enough now, the ends brushed along his shoulders, and he absently pulled it up, nodding at the nape of his neck. Blue eyes flicked up in exasperation at the sun that beat down mercilessly. He ditched the old Buick after his arrival in the bustling city. He felt almost immediately claustrophobic, the amount of bodies that could be packed into the single city overwhelming. The loss of green space to the concrete jungle disappointing. Cedric honestly didn't think he could stay there long, but it was a total change of scenery for him. Completely unexpected, and he hoped it would keep the pack off of his trail. They would never think the little country boy would end up in the largest city in America. Would never expect it. As a matter of fact, it surprised even him. The amusement in himself faded into irritation as he was jostled by another stranger, and a low growl rumbled in his throat as he turned his eyes and met the startled gaze that looked up and then quickly away with a mumbled noise of apology. Most humans had the instinct to avoid predators like him. Most. It seemed the population of New York City lacked the proper fear of things they didn't understand. Or maybe they were too immune, their wits dulled by the constant barrage of horrors, and they turned a blind eye to everything. He shook his head, much like a wolf, and shook the irritation away. This was a good thing. He was no one of import, and no one would notice him enough to be questioned, even if the pack did manage to follow him. Rogue. He was considered savage, but that's not why they hunted him. He wasn't savage, and they knew that well enough. He'd wanted to be a vet, goddammit. He'd wanted to heal with his hands, not destroy. He'd wanted a lot, maybe too much, and the memories assailed him for a moment, pushed him back to the small town in Colorado where he'd been taken in, and he thought he'd finally found the family he'd been unconsciously looking for. Others that not only accepted him, but understood him. It had been so for a while, long enough for him to let his guard down. It seemed, though, that the pack hid behind false faces as much as their wolven forms, and he'd been lulled, gotten himself in too deep before he realized the truth of his surroundings. He was pushed and prodded and provoked until he unleashed on them a power as ruthless and savage as they made him out to be, and had killed what little hope he had left in himself that he wasn't the monster that howled in the night. "Watch it!" The words snapped out of him before he could catch his own tongue. Another stranger had plowed into him, a man in a suit, and he'd barked the command with a step in his direction before catching himself in the frightened gaze, then grumbled as he turned on his heel. wearing Converses with no socks, a pair of old cut-off shorts, and a plain old white tee that was threadbare cotton and didn't hide the tattoos that covered his torso. He still ducked into the little hole in the wall, something that was a mix of a classy bistro with white linen on the tables and a homey cove with eclectic art hung on the dark walls. A waitress stopped to stare as she was setting down drinks. He ducked his eyes, headed straight for the bar. He had to get out of that crowd on the streets just to be able to breathe. The bartender gave him an easy once-over, then jerked his chin toward the back. There's a patio on the back. Cedric's feet turned toward the incline of the other man's head without a word and headed out for the patio instead. It was there, outside in the humid heat, with the scent of so many strangers clogging his nose, that he heard his heartbeat thundering, and he knew he'd just had some sort of a mild panic attack. The flush of heat stung his cheeks, and he lowered his eyes as a beer was brought out and cautiously set down by the bartender himself. He didn't like the way the bartender noticed him. He didn't like the way that notice had turned to caution, and he sure as fuck did not like when he reached for the glass and his own fizzer sizzled and smoked against the cold glass. The bartender took a step back with a muttered oath. Cedric jumped up, only to meet with a narrowed gaze filled with too much knowledge. The bartender backed up another step, spread his hands in a white flag gesture. "Sit down, drink the beer. No one will bother you here." That was a lie. The pack would always be out to more than just bother him. But it didn't stop Cedric from sinking back down and giving in to the command. He wasn't naturally a submissive, but he was tired and hot, and the cold beer did more than soothe his parched throat. It dulled some of the panic, and he drank a little deeper.